Okay, good afternoon, at least afternoon where I am, and welcome. My name is Mark Memegonyan. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs for the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NAASR, and I thank you for joining us today for the public launch and discussion of an important volume, Monuments and Identities in the Caucasus, Karabagh, Nakhichevan, and Azerbaijan in Contemporary Geopolitical Conflict, which was published late last year in the Brill series, Texts and Studies in Eastern Christianity. When I say that this is a most valuable work of scholarship, I trust it will be understood that I'm not alluding to the book's price, but rather to its impressive contents, which includes, as we shall hear, the work of a number of scholars working across a range of disciplines. And we're fortunate to have with us today the book's co-editors and the author of the book's introduction, whom we shall meet presently. Of course, it was not feasible to have all of the authors who contributed to the volume with us today, but we will take the part for the whole. It's all the more gratifying to see this work published, as it was supported in part by 2 grants from NAASR and the Knights of Vartan Fund for Armenian Studies to help it to come to fruition. It was recognized that this is a book that fills significant gaps in the scholarship, gaps which we might argue, and perhaps we might discuss later, we would have collectively done well to have filled much earlier, since such gaps tend not to remain rather empty, but are often filled with pseudo-scholarship rather than the kind of high-quality scholarship that this book presents. Anyway, this is a scenario we can talk about later. I also want to call attention, by the way, to another book that was published last year that can and I hope will form the basis for a program or webinar in the near future too, since it is complementary to Monuments and Identities in the Caucasus, namely the book Caucasian Albania, an International Handbook, edited by Joost Gippert and Jasmine Dumtragut, and including the work of a number of outstanding scholars, including one of our speakers today, Igor Dorfmann-Lazarev. I also want to acknowledge with gratitude the co-sponsors of today's webinar, the Association Internationale des Études Arméniennes, AIEA, the Mashtots Chair in Armenian Studies at Harvard University, the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA, the Richard Hovhannissian Chair in Modern Armenian History at UCLA, and the Society for Armenian Studies, SAS. We have the pleasure of having one of those co-sponsors with us today, and I would like to briefly introduce him and ask him to give his introductory remarks. Professor Sebouh David Aslanian is Professor of History and holds the Richard Hovhannissian Endowed Chair of Modern Armenian History at UCLA. He is also the Director of the Armenian Studies Center within the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute, and he is the author of From the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, the Global Trade Networks of Armenian Merchants from New Julfa, 2011, and Early Modernity and Mobility, Port Cities and Printers Across the Armenian Diaspora, 1512 to 1800, published last year. And in January 2022, Sebouh was the organizer of the conference, Is the Pen Mightier Than the Sword? Historians' Disputed Ownership of History and Ethnic Conflict in the South Caucasus, the themes and subject matter of which relate directly to those of the publication under discussion today. And we're very fortunate to have a valued friend and colleague with us today. So please, Sebouh, unmute yourself and welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that very nice introduction. I'd like to begin by congratulating the 2 co-editors of this magnificent volume for the high caliber of scholarship that they have displayed and for making this work available to us at a time when it is most timely and necessary. So let me begin my few words of introduction by going back to 1918 in the Ottoman Empire. And in 1918, an Ottoman Turkish official, Reza Nur, who would later, 5 years later, become an important representative of the Turkish delegation at Lausanne, wrote a 1-volume Armenian history, Ermeni Tarahı, in which he drew from the depths of the collective pan-Turanian imaginary, to use Hans Lucas Kieser's terminology here, to offer the following assessment of the relationship between Armenians, Turks, and Anatolia and the South Caucasus. And I quote from this work. Reza Nur writes, "This proves that since 4000 or at least since 2000 BC, the true autochthonous population in central and eastern Anatolia, on the whole Black Sea coast and in the Caucasus and on the territory of what is now called Armenia, are the Turanians. Look on the land called Armenia," he continues to write. "Our forefathers, the Turanians, lived there from an unknown historical time, but at least since 4,000 years until 300 BC. That is 3,700 years, and 900 years later, that is like 11th century or so, we Turks lived there again until today. That is for 3,700 years. Well, our lineage lived in Armenia since 4,700 years. And he concludes this passage by saying the Armenians lived there only under the condition of being minoritarian. For 2 centuries only, they possessed states, whereas the Turanians lived there always as state builders and as a majority." Unquote. So Reza Nur, a trained medical doctor turned historian, was only one among several members of the Young Turk elite to embrace the racialized and toxic European discourse of social Darwinism. He wrote a 9-volume history of the Turks and a 1-volume Armenian history, a manuscript of which was recently discovered in a German archival collection. I have chosen to begin my introductory remarks, marking the publication last year of this very important volume under discussion at the moment, with this passage. So Nur and the Pan-Turanian social imaginary are important promontories in the Ottoman past that give us disturbing insights into the Caucasian Albanian imaginary and its invented tradition or usable past weaponized in Baku to whitewash and justify the genocidal ethnic cleansing of indigenous Armenians from their homes in Artsakh. Let me turn now quickly to Farida Mamedova, one of the chief architects of Azeri revisionism with regard to the Armenians both in Artsakh and in general. Yoav Karni, an Israeli journalist who interviewed Mamedova in the 1990s, characterized her worldview as follows, and I quote again from this book on the Highlanders, which is an account of his travels through the South Caucasus. And he writes, "To Mamedova, the Armenians are a people without land. Every people in the world has a history based on land," she said, and he's quoting her. "You have the history of France, or the history of England, or the history of Italy. Every people except the Armenians. In their case, it is the history of Armenians because Armenia, as such, never existed." Unquote. Mamedova is not alone, of course, in peddling such views, since, as we know, her own mentor and another non-professionally trained historian, Zia Bunyatov, had already laid the foundations of this discourse in the post-1965 era. More recently, another neophyte and follower of the Bunyatov-Mamedova school, Kamala Imranlı, frames the picture of the Neo-Albanian Turanian imaginary in the following manner in a curious account of Armenian history published in a work that was issued by the Haydar Aliyev Foundation in 2007, called War Against Azerbaijan, Targeting Cultural Heritage. And with no irony, here she writes the following, and I quote, "Although the Republic of Armenia does not have an ethnic Azerbaijani population now, its territory was a native land of the Azerbaijanis long before the Armenians appeared there for the first time. A considerable portion of the territory of modern Armenia, until the occupation by Russia in the early 19th century, was part of different states established by the ancestors of the Azerbaijanis, namely Caucasian Albania, and after the arrival of the Arabs, different Azerbaijani Muslim states such as the Sajids, Salarids, Shaddadids, and Atabeys, Hulakids, Garagoyunlu, Akhgoyunlu, with its peak during the Azerbaijani Safavid state from 1501 to 1736, and so forth, unquote. What can these snippets culled from a long history of wading through the underworld of Azeri revisionism over the last half-century tell us about the present? At least three conclusions are warranted, I argue. First, and most importantly, though the discourse of Caucasian Albania, as our authors and contributors today will make amply clear, was certainly traceable to at least three phases of the modern history of Azerbaijani nationalism, beginning in what scholars like Ron Sunni and Terry Martin have described as Stalinist primordialism of the late 1930s, and as Igor himself has amply documented in his own rich contribution to this volume, what we need to do is not only satisfy ourselves with a Soviet genealogy of these ideas, tracing them back to the 1930s, but rather attempt to go further back to the Young Turk period in Ottoman history. Second, scholars and activists alike need to pay special attention to the racialized and social Darwinist imaginaries populated by phantasmagoric, almost hallucinatory images of Turan or Albania as they might be, to understand how new nations might usurp and appropriate other people's history and cultural monuments. Studying and laying bare the invented traditions of this type, to use Eric Hobsbawm's terminology, Hobsbawm was a professor of mine 30 years ago at the New School, is an essential part of combating ethnic cleansing and genocide. Third and lastly, and as Eric Hobsbawm once again noted in an essay in the 1990s, historians, in quotation marks, including those who are medical doctors, engineers, or otherwise, computer scientists, and so forth, are to nationalism what poppy growers in Pakistan are to heroin addicts. They supply the raw material for the market, that is, the past, or an invented version of it that can be weaponized, unquote, or an invented version of it that can be weaponized to incite genocide and pave way to the bulldozing of other people's history and monuments. And I will close my brief remarks here in this fashion. Thank again, Mark, for putting together this event, and our contributors and editors of this volume for taking the time to do this necessary and important work. Thank you.
Sebouh, thank you so much for those remarks, those very important remarks that get at a lot of the themes of the book, and as well as placing it in a larger context as well. And I hope we can return to some of these ideas during the discussion afterwards. I want to now just give very brief introductions to our three speakers before turning the microphone over to them for their presentations in the order in which they will be speaking. Marcello Flores, who is the author of the introduction to this volume, was professor of comparative history at the University of Siena and director of the European Master Program in Human Rights and Genocide Studies. He is the author of several monographs, including Storia della Shoah, 2005, The Story of Human Rights, 2011, Il Genocidio degli Armeni, 2015, and Il Genocidio, 2021. Haroutioun Khatchadourian, co-editor of the volume, pursued the career of an engineer before dedicating himself to the protection of historical heritage. He has studied the history of Armenian arts at INALCO in Paris, and the focus of his interest is on the art of Khachkars. He is the author of two books, L'Art des Khachkars, 2014, and Localité et bien culturelle arménienne dans la Turquie ottomane, 2016. And I apologize to all French speakers watching for my appalling pronunciation. Forgive me. Igor Dorfmann-Lazarev, the other co-editor of the volume, spent a large part of his childhood in Baku before the massacres of 1988 and 1990 irrevocably altered the cultural landscape of that city. He received his PhD and habilitation at École pratique des hautes études Sorbonne, and now teaches Oriental languages at Sofia University St. Clement Okhritsky. The focus of his publications is on the Armenians' relationships with their neighbors in the Middle Ages, and he is the author of Christ in the Armenian Tradition, 2016, and has edited Sharing Myths, Texts, and Sanctuaries in the South Caucasus, 2022. Before I yield to our speakers, let me remind the audience that they may use the Zoom Q&A function to submit questions, which will be addressed as time permits following the speakers' presentations. And once again, thank you to everyone who is with us today. And let me now ask Professor Flores to speak.
Thank you very much, Mark. Today was the final day of the public hearings held by the International Court of Justice. We still don't have a press release concerning the application of the 1965 International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which deal in this case with ethnic cleansing, but also with the destruction of cultural heritage sites, propaganda of hatred, and of course, crime of war and acts of discrimination. The court must decide the merits of the Azerbaijani motion claiming the International Court of Justice does not have jurisdiction over the 3-year-old suit brought by Armenia. In the provisional measures indicated by the court in the order of 7 December 2021, after the suit of Armenia, in relation to the protection of cultural heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh, the court found that Azerbaijan had violated Article 5 of the CERD, the convention, including in its cultural and religious heritage. Several international human rights treaties include provisions closely related to or indirectly promoting cultural heritage. Farida Shahid, the first United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, concretized the relation between cultural heritage and cultural rights when locating the legal basis of the right of access to and enjoyment of cultural heritage, in particular, I quote, in the right to take part in cultural life, the right of members of minorities to enjoy their own culture, and the right of indigenous people to self-determination and to maintain, control, protect, and develop cultural heritage. Unquote. Cultural heritage also has links to further human rights such as human dignity as well as identity, if one accepts UNESCO's premise holding that, I quote, culture is central to man and that without it, no rights are possible since it is the matrix from which all else must spring, unquote. In order to see whether Azerbaijan is complying with the international law on the protection of cultural heritage, it seems vital that the region remains under surveillance by the international community. As the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine understandably consumes much of the international attention, it is nevertheless important not to lose sight of the Nagorno-Karabakh region and the compliance with international law of the actors present in this region. While it should be possible to assume that a UN member state complies with the order of its principal judicial organ, being particularly vigilant might even raise Azerbaijan motivation to comply. The International Court of Justice has demonstrated its readiness to fulfill its role as the principal judicial organ of the United Nations and the international community, also in the relation to the protection of cultural heritage. Speaking on this Tuesday before the court in The Hague, Armenia's representative accused Azerbaijan of promoting hatred of Armenians at the official level, a policy, he said, reached a climax in Azerbaijan's military takeover of Nagorno-Karabakh last year, after which the mass exodus of Armenians was a clear act of ethnic cleansing. The large-scale military offensive against Artsakh on September 2023 followed the request in February of that year by the International Court of Justice of ending the blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh, but without possibility to enforce this ruling. The decision of Armenia to request the court to adjudge that Azerbaijan was violating many articles of the Convention to Eliminate Racial Discrimination included, after ethnic cleansing, the need to refrain from, I quote, destroying Armenian cultural heritage or otherwise eliminating the existence of the historical Armenian cultural presence or inhibiting Armenians' access and enjoyment thereof, unquote. Armenia alleged that soldiers from Azerbaijan committed acts of destruction and vandalism against Armenian religious and cultural heritage sites, as well as acts of desecration of Armenian cemeteries and religious artifacts, and that repeated destruction, alteration, and desecration of Armenian cultural heritage and religious sites in the territories controlled by Azerbaijan constituted, according to Armenia, plausible racial discrimination in potential breach of Articles 2 and 5 of the CERD. The volume you are presenting and discussing today focuses precisely on the destruction of the Armenian monumental patrimony by Azerbaijan, which found a new impetus in the aftermath of the 2020 war, but which has been a constant worrying feature of this century and of the last decade of the previous one, and much more before. We see today a large, even if often superficial, debate on genocide, using the word to harsher condemn the violation of human rights, but nobody seems to refer anything to the situation, the actual and the previous one, of Nagorno-Karabakh. The wonderful effort of this book, with all the informer and clever contribution, can help to put again the problem of cultural genocide at the center of the debate, since it is in the violence against cultural heritage, the core of this volume, that we can see today an important aspect of the human rights violation that we hope the International Court of Justice will deal with it in the next future. Thank you.
Marcello, thank you very, very much for those comments. And we now turn to co-editor Haroutioun Khatchadourian. Haroutioun, who is muted.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to share the screen in order to show a PowerPoint presentation. So. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So this short presentation will be dedicated to my part of my chapter, in fact, in the book. But before going on, I would like to just to talk a little bit about the title of the book, Karabagh, Nakhichevan, and Azerbaijan. We don't see the word Armenian in the title because the focus of the book is the Azerbaijan politics on heritage. There is a second point I would like to emphasize. As you see, there is Karabagh, there is Nakhichevan and Azerbaijan, three geographical area which are very important because they are both independent geographical area, I would say, and globally linked all together. But in fact, heritage I'm going to talk, is related to these three geographical area. So in part 3 of the book, so there are 2 chapters dedicated to heritage, especially. The first one is called Cultural Heritage as a Political Tool, and the second one is the appendix, where we can see an inventory of the Armenian religious heritage. We have taken in this inventory only churches and monasteries of Nakhichevan and Karabagh, and not other monuments such as castle, Hajkar, and so on. So we have about 686 monuments, as I said, churches and monasteries. So let's have a look quickly at the first, this chapter, Cultural Heritage as a Political Tool. And I would like to just put a question here. What is cultural heritage for Azerbaijan? What does cultural heritage or monuments mean for Azerbaijan? This is quite important because in this chapter, we've been dealing with in Azerbaijani inventory, particularly the book quoted by Sebouh Aslanian from it was called Western Azerbaijan. So what can we see when we study this inventory? First of all, these inventory are a potpourri of objects, in fact, and this is really the inventory are very bad quality in terms of accuracy, in terms of up-to-date data. Let's see what are these objects are. So in these graphics, we can see that more than 60% of the inventory are cultural establishment, and only 20% are historical or architectural monuments. So what does cultural establishment mean? If we go into details, we see that, first of all, these cultural institutions are museum, libraries, music schools, art galleries, social clubs, parks, and so on, so on. So very far away from what Armenians are talking when we present our cultural heritage. Second, what we can see on this table is figures, and at the top you can see a list: human rights, communication, Artsakh, and United Nations. These are communication that have statements that have been given during different sessions or meetings with United Nations or human rights and so on. And what we can see in the figure that the figures are very, very different from one statement to another statement. So there is no coherency between these figures. And sometimes, for example, they talk about mosques, 61 mosques in the list of 2007. And then 10 years after, they say there are just 9 mosques. And in the other figures or inventory they give, there is no mosque. So there is a very bad data, and the inventory is far away from classical inventory, but it's more or less popular, as I said, and the list of objects, basically. What we can say also is that for the Azerbaijan, the inventory are an opportunity to generate fake information. And I would like to quote here to mention for example, the Wikipedia. If we look at the Wikipedia description of Armenian monument, and let's say we are going to take, for example, Echmiadzin, the Cathedral of Echmiadzin. If we compare English version of Wikipedia with the German version, Armenian version, French version, English version, so more or less all these information are coherent. But when we open the translation, the Azerbaijani translation of the same Echmiadzin Cathedral, we see that the fake information inside. Echmiadzin is called Üç Müezzin, and is a Turkish temple. So this is a kind of fake information the Azerbaijani propose in the inventory. There is also, it's also a way to lie. I think the inventory is a means to lie. So I'm going to just to show you an example. When this table represents the ethnical distribution within Azerbaijan so this is official numbers, official figures, from 1979 to 909. And what we can see is a decrease of minorities in Azerbaijan and an increase of Turkish Azerbaijans. And if we go to, and if we draw a curve, so it's really interesting because we see that there is a decrease of multiculturalism in Azerbaijan. And this is this proves that the propaganda of state propaganda of Azerbaijan about the minorities are really a lie when they say, for example, we are a tolerant country, there are many minorities and so on, but this is really a lie. So these also are official numbers. Also, of course, the inventory or the objects in the inventory are also a target to destroy. This is when we look at the, for example, the distribution of Armenian monument here. This is a map of the monuments inventory at 696. Only I say again, I'm saying in just churches and monastery. We see here the distribution in the red color, and if we look at what we had right now. This is a map of the completely destroyed monument, of course, in Nakhichevan, and they have started also in Artsakh. So finally, the cultural heritage for Azerbaijan is an object of negotiation highlighting UNESCO weakness, or weaknesses, in fact. Why? Because cultural heritage for Azerbaijan are loots or spoils of war and not heritage. Now, let's look at the risks related to this heritage. The first risk is the physical risk, total destruction or partial destruction of some or many monuments or all monuments like in Nakhichevan. But there is also the other types of risks. Functional alteration, transformation, for example, of churches into house or library and so on, or another kind of monument. Or cultural alteration means keeping the religious monument as keeping the monument as a religious monument, but transforming the architecture into a mosque or a Russian church, or even deleting the inscription and saying that these are Albanian church. But there are another risk, which is not unfortunately a risk because we already have it. It's the denial of information from UNESCO. This is very important. Let's say, let's have I'm going to give you two examples. Julfa and Baku Armenian Church. Julfa. When you go to the website of UNESCO and you start searching Julfa, or you start searching, let's say, Tombuktu or Nimrut or Palmyra or Buddha of Afghanistan, you get many results, many items, many occurrences of these words. But when you look at Julfa and the destruction of Julfa, there is no information about this destruction. And the same for the Baku Armenian Church, which was in the old city of Baku. The old city of Baku is in the UNESCO list. And there was a church in this old city called the Holy Mother of God, and now it's totally destroyed, but no information about this destruction on the website of UNESCO. The next risk, I would say, is the increase of falsification of history, such as Wikipedia or school book or tourist books, of course. And the last one I wrote here is the zoo strategy. What does it mean, zoo strategy? It's a strategy where we destroy everything, but leave just one monument or one village alive. The example, the typical example is the Udi village of Nij, where there is a monument. The zoo strategy is a kind of Indian reservation in the United States. So maybe they will follow this kind of strategy in the future. So my last page, it's related to what we can do with what we have to do more than we can do, what we have to do with. So we have to alert, inform, and question about the falsification of history. This is very important, and this book, I think this book will go in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haroutioun. And now I'd like to ask Igor Dorfmann-Lazarev to speak. Igor.
Thank you very much. I should like to begin by extending our thanks to the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research in Belmont, Massachusetts, for their support throughout our work and for organizing this meeting. This book analyzes the ways in which the architectural and cultural landscape of the South Caucasus correlates with its national identities, the older and the younger ones. In our focus are two regions situated in the east of historical Armenia: Karabagh, also known by the ancient Armenian name of Artsakh, and Nakhichevan. The continuous Armenian presence in both these regions over 2 millennia is attested by chronicles and numerous monuments. Amongst the ancient, medieval, and early modern monuments are carved stele, cemeteries, churches, crypts, monasteries, pilgrimage sites, various examples of civil architecture, and inscriptions. These sites have since centuries served as points of convergence for the Armenians, places of their commemorative and religious celebrations, as well as feasting and socialization. Over the past decades, however, almost all of the Armenian monuments in the region of Nakhichevan and elsewhere on the territories controlled by Azerbaijan have been destroyed. The book aims to awaken the world to the danger that today is threatening the architectural and artistic heritage of Karabakh. The novelty of our approach to the study of the rich cultural legacy of Karabakh, Nakhichevan, and the adjoining regions consists in combining diverse disciplinary perspectives. The volume is a fruit of collaboration between historians, archaeologists, historians of art, cultural anthropologists, sociologists, specialists in the protection of cultural heritage, and experts on international law. A prominent place in this volume is occupied by 3 chapters written by Patrick Donabedian. First, Donabedian offers a survey of the development of architectural forms in the southeastern and eastern provinces of Armenia from the early Christian period to the 19th century. Then he focuses on various religious buildings of Karabagh and Nakhichevan, taken singly, while analyzing their construction material and techniques, the semantics and symbolism of their forms, and their influence on the Muslim architecture in the Caucasus and Anatolia. He shows in particular that the türbe, medieval Muslim mausoleums, which are based on the principle of a cylinder with a conical dome, are related to the drum and dome of the ancient Armenian churches. These chapters acquire a particular relief thanks to the historical essays prepared by Claude Moutafian and Alexandre Hakopian. The phenomenon of deliberate destruction of historical monuments and cultural institutions reflects attempts at constructing a new collective identity in Azerbaijan. These attempts are likewise taken into examination in our book. This is done from 2 different perspectives. One perspective is offered by Viktor Schnirelman, Stepan Asturian, and myself, who have focused on the shaping of Azerbaijani nationalism in the Soviet Union. Azerbaijan's official historiography, as engineered between the 1930s and the 1950s and cultivated since, is based on ethnogenetic mythology. No place for national consciousness or national or political will in the USSR. Only national belonging was recognized, which was predetermined by one's ethnic roots. Consequently, the principle of self-determination of peoples, although it had been endorsed by the Bolsheviks in 1917, was eventually rejected. One could not shape his nationhood, but could only be subjected to it. National belonging thus obliges one to subdue to a despot. In 1938, the suppression of instruction in the local languages of Azerbaijan, in Kurdish, in Talish, in Lezgi, and in many others, was justified by the first secretary of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan, Mir Jafar Bagirov, with recourse to the following argument: the true identity of these populations is none other than Azerbaijani, and only instruction delivered in the Azerbaijani language can implement ideological control over their cultural development. Therefore, claimed Bagirov, calling into question the Azerbaijani identity of these populations amounts to colluding with the enemies of the state. This approach still remains valid in Azerbaijan today, and it underlies the complete disappearance of Armenians and their culture from Azerbaijan. It is not hard to see that today claims to ethnic roots and bonds of blood, I quote obviously, justify conquest and cultural destruction east as well as north of the Black Sea. Another perspective on the shaping of Azerbaijani identity is offered by Etienne Copeau and Oya Yildiz, who have assessed the role of pan-Turkism in the consolidation of the official ideology of the Azerbaijani state. A synthesis of different strands explored in this book is to be found in the essays written by Haroutioun Khatchadourian, who spoke before me, Hamlet Petrosyan, and their co-authors. They have examined several particular cases of destruction and obliteration of monuments, have inventoried the religious monuments of Karabagh and Nakhichevan, have identified the phases of their degradation and demolition, and have assessed the role of Azerbaijani historiographic revisionism in the process of cultural erasure. Alessandro Checchi and Francesco Romani have analyzed the role of international law in guaranteeing the defense of cultural heritage in the course of armed conflicts, as well as the causes of failure of international institutions, as UNESCO cited by Haroutioun Khatchadourian, the failure of such international institutions to accomplish their mission. The book also contains a precious witness of Arkam Ayvazyan, a valiant explorer who between the mid-1960s and the late 1980s undertook numerous perilous journeys to his native land of Nakhichevan in order to document its history. Ever since the treaty signed in 1921 in Moscow by Soviet Russia and Kemalist Turkey, this region had remained almost completely closed to visitors. In 1965, Arkam Ayvazyan, was apprehended by police for taking photos of churches and was interrogated by none else than Heydar Aliyev, the future first secretary of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan and the father of the actual president of Azerbaijan. Aliyev urged Ayvazyan, forget that there are any Armenian monuments or Armenians in Nakhichevan. Many of the stele, churches, and monasteries that have been erased in Nakhichevan over the last half a century are known to us only thanks to Ayvazyan's photographs and descriptions. We started to devise our book soon after the war that Azerbaijan unleashed against Karabagh in September 2020, and that was concluded by the disastrous truce signed under Russia's patronage in November of the same year. In elaborating this book, our concern was not only that the monuments of Karabagh are very beautiful and that their loss impoverishes our knowledge of the history of the Caucasus and even the history of the Western arts. Indeed, since the early 19th century, the Armenian arts have attracted the attention of Russian, French, English, German, and Italian scholars. But in order to explain yet another preoccupation that prompted us to prepare this publication, I wish to evoke the Polish jurist Raphael Lemkin. In the summer of 1944, that is to say, almost a year before the end of the Second World War, he proposed a definition for the policies adopted by Nazi forces against various national and ethnic groups in the occupied Europe. Lemkin's career and his ideas are analyzed in the introductory chapter of the book by Marcello Flores, who spoke before me. Lemkin distinguished several techniques of genocide, it is Lemkin's term, describing in particular the genocide in the cultural field, again, Lemkin's terminology. Investigating diverse regional cases, he claimed that as a result of aggression of the Poles, the Slovenes, and the Jews, these peoples were, I quote, deprived of inspiration from the existing cultural and artistic values, which rendered impossible national creative activities. I repeat, national creative activities. End of quotation. Consequently, the survival of the nations themselves was endangered. Indeed, a nation was defined by Lemkin in a very specific way, not by any ethnic or territorial criterion, but precisely as a, I quote, a human group capable of making original creative contribution to the world. In other words, in order to remain capable of creative work, every human group has the task of protecting its cultural landscape. The apprehension that has accompanied us throughout various stages of editing was that the progressive loss of historical monuments in Baku, on the southern slopes of the Greater Caucasus, in Nakhichevan, in the region of Ganzak, and in Karabagh, endangers the very existence of the Armenians. Not being a jurist, I am not qualified to determine which specific cases can be defined as a genocide. Besides, over the past decades, this term has frequently been misused. I am speaking only as a historian who is able to recognize in a similitude between the phenomena that alarmed Lemkin at the darkest moment of Europe's history and the treatment reserved to the Armenians and their cultural institutions on all the territories under the control of Baku. Owing to the complex structure of the book, the editorial tasks that it involved and that we accomplished in coordination between Sofia and Paris were demanding. They regarded primary sources, textual and archaeological, contributions originally written in a variety of languages, photographic material, tables, graphs, the transliteration of different languages, and indexing. Our deep thanks go to Dirk Bakker and Marjolein von Zeulen from the Brill editorial department. With boundless patience and generosity, they have helped us to find best possible solutions to numerous questions and difficulties arising at different stages of our work, as well as seeing our manuscript through 4 rounds of editorial proofs. I should also like to record the high professionalism of the typesetters, whose names I unfortunately do not know, and to thank them for all their labor. When the manuscript reached the typesetters, the amputated Republic of Karabagh had, alas, been subjected to a siege, which represented nothing less than an organized starvation. As for the occupied territories of Karabagh, on them the Azerbaijani authorities had already set about demolishing and obliterating Armenian monuments. The book was printed only after the flight from Karabagh of its entire population. To conclude, our book has a limited scope to recognize the disaster, to describe its amplitude, and to identify those responsible. But the Armenians, both in Armenia and in the diaspora, need yet address themselves to the ways their creative potential can be recovered despite the destructions and the disappearance of Armenian population on all the territories controlled by Baku. We hope that this book may be a helpful tool in this enormous task. Thank you.
Igor, thank you so much, and thank you to all of our speakers. Now, I know we are going to be losing Sebouh momentarily, so I wanted to just ask you, Sebouh, before we lose you, if you would like to offer any remarks. But you're muted, though.
I just want to reiterate my thanks to the editors of this volume, especially to my friend Igor for putting together such a thoroughly satisfying, rigorous, scholarly account of the distortions of Armenian history and history in general in this area. And I only end by saying that I'm not alone in praying or hoping against hope that people will come to their senses before too long, and that these kinds of genocidal acts, including the usurpation and appropriation of histories for the purpose of justifying genocidal acts and bulldozing of cultural heritage, I only hope that people will come to their senses and that our collective humanity will prevail at the end of all this. And on that note, I will have to ask for your forgiveness because I have some other engagement to attend. So I look forward to listening to the discussions later on. Thank you.
You have our forgiveness and our gratitude. Thanks, Sebouh. When this event was scheduled a while back, of course, it was with the consciousness that it was being scheduled during the week of commemoration of the Armenian genocide. And while on the face of it, I suppose, or observed from one perspective, the program today does not relate to 1915 and the Armenian genocide. But it obviously, I hope anyway, does not take a lot of creative thinking or close paying attention of the comments today to understand that there is, in fact, an important connection which has been made one way or another, I think, by each of our speakers today. So I want to invite again the audience to use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit your questions. And I want to begin with one question which may be directed towards Igor, but could be addressed if anyone else would like to. And that is regarding the legacy of Stalin's nationalities policies in Azerbaijan, but also in Armenia and elsewhere in the Soviet and post-Soviet space, and the problem of autonomous regions. Since the two of the areas in the name of this book, Nakhichevan and Karabagh, were autonomous regions in the Soviet Union, and they are particularly problematic. And I wonder if there is any causal relationship between that puzzling status they enjoyed and their current state.
Yes, thank you, Mark. This question, I would single out three aspects. One of them is the infantilization of nations, rendering them incapable of taking political action, incapable of negotiating. The second one is the emotional side. You see, once you speak of a nation, of national, you are touching upon the state interests. And if you express a wrong idea, it is a question of treason or danger to the state. And this blocks discussion, frank discussion. This also blocks compromises, search for compromises. These are main aspects that I would single out in this legacy.
And did the fact of these regions, that is Nakhichevan and Karabagh, existing as autonomous regions, is there any relationship between that strange category, or strange to Western eyes maybe, category and the problems that have ensued?
Yeah, there is an overlapping of two perspectives. On the one hand, there was an ambition at the early stages of the Soviet state to respond somehow to the question of to the self-determination, the principle of self-determination of nations. But then within the totalitarian state built by Lenin and Stalin, that principle was reduced to none. It is also related to the fact that Lenin, Stalin, but already before them, Engels, to whom one of the most quoted writer of Lenin and Stalin, regarded in a very negative way national movements springing from small nations. It was obligatorily had to be obligatorily reactionary. So there was only one nation that could become a vehicle of progress and of historical process. Those who did not, which had no status of the titular nations in the Soviet Union, were not expected to express any positive ideas, and that determined, well, the Soviet history, but it determined their approach to nations within the Soviet Union, but also beyond.
Thank you. Question from, I'm going to, if I may, combine two questions from audience members. One is, and anyone can answer this as well, certainly Haroutioun and Marcello as well. Nationalism on the part of Azeris, while of issue, can be explained. However, how can the colossal failure by UNESCO be explained? And then from another viewer, what specific actions could UNESCO take to protect Armenian monuments under Azerbaijani control?
Maybe I can say some words about UNESCO.
Thank you.
In fact, UNESCO as a UN, United Nations organization or international organization, has a principle which is very important. It's the same principle in the United Nations also. It's the sovereignty principle. So UNESCO cannot intervene in any countries if the country doesn't want. So this principle is is very important, and this is why UNESCO. Well, this is one of the reasons. There are many reasons, but this is one of the reasons that UNESCO cannot come and protect cannot enter the territory of any states. So we don't have, well, I would say UNESCO is not a saver. It's an illusion, in fact, and we don't have to forget this. So there is some other reasons also. Structurally, the UNESCO cannot intervene in the territory, but UNESCO has no tools to use, cannot force any countries to accept experts and other specialists to come and to see monuments. So we don't have to dream about UNESCO. UNESCO is an international organization and not a supranational organization. So this is why we don't have to wait for UNESCO in our case, in fact.
Even allowing for the essentially inutility of UNESCO as you've described it, you commented in your remarks on even the absence of any mention of the abuses of Armenian cultural heritage. They are not, I presume, powerless to even take note of such actions, correct?
Yes, this is correct. Maybe what we can do, and it's in this direction, I think. We have to work in order UNESCO publish or communicate about this destruction of Nakhichevan destruction, for example. And we have to do something in this way. I think this is very important for us. But waiting for protection is an illusion.
Thank you. Question for Marcello. Marcello, you've written extensively about the Armenian genocide in your scholarship, and I don't want to force the connection that I was discussing earlier, but I wanted to ask you for your thoughts as someone who has studied the Armenian genocide in some detail and is involved in this book project, where you see the where for you are the connections between the events of 1915 and the events of the past 4 years.
I guess exactly the focus of this book, the cultural heritage, is probably the most important link with the destruction of the Armenian life, generally speaking, of the 1915. In this case, too, there is the possibility of a physical genocide, but fortunately it was not going on. There are surely crimes against humanity or crimes of war from Azerbaijan, but we don't see in the moment a really possibility of a genocide against Armenian. But the destruction of the cultural heritage is something that was also at the core of the genocide of 1915-16. And even if this doesn't appear in the Convention on Genocide as a real act of genocide, we know from other international treaties that like the discussion that is going on just today, we don't know how it's finished by the International Court of Justice, that the link between the physical destruction and the destruction of cultural heritage is now something that we can fight for recognition, that years before we cannot afford to do.
Thank you very much. I believe it was Haroutioun who used the phrase, which I had not heard before, but it's clear what the meaning was, of the zoo strategy. And do you think, and others can join in this as well, is there a different vision, do you think, for the fate of monuments in Artsakh as opposed to in Nakhichevan? In Nakhichevan, at this point, we're talking about almost 100% erasure. Yes. In Karabagh, it would take some effort to get to that point. Do you think there is going to be less outright destruction and perhaps token preservation under false pretenses of rebranding these monuments, or do you expect significant amount of physical destruction as well? I realize I'm asking you to predict the future, but that's what I'm doing.
This is a difficult question. Do you know why? Because the actions of the Azerbaijan are inconsistent. I mean, it's not our logic, and it's difficult to understand what they are going to do. They can totally destroy it as they did in the Nakhichevan, all the monuments. But maybe I think they are going to keep but to transform some, maybe 10 or 20 monuments, the major monuments. And as you said, they are going to rebrand, the branding will change. And they will keep, because they will understand that tourism is important for the country, and they will go on with the tolerance propaganda. But no one knows. Maybe no one knows, unfortunately.
Understood. Yes.
Mm.
Question from an audience member. Can we hear how the data collection of monuments was done, given the restrictions on access in Nakhichevan and in Karabagh or elsewhere in Azerbaijan? And thanking you for your work.
Yes. So there are, let's say there are many, there are three different areas. For Nakhichevan, Argham Ayvazian, we used Argham's data collected during 30 years, around 30 years and even more. So these are only the only data we have for Nakhichevan. For Artsakh, we have Artsakh, well, I will say for the mountainous Karabagh, a lot of works have been done by the Research on Armenian Architecture organization in Armenia, and mainly by Samvel Karapetyan. Before, I would say before the independence and just after the independence. Samvel Karapetyan's work cover more than the mountainous Karabagh and goes even up to the Kura River. For the mountainous Karabagh, the inventory has been done by the government of Karabagh during these 30 years, in fact. And so we used this data to build a database of monuments.
A question that, again, for anyone, please, to answer, and it's a difficult question, I guess, as they all are, but the book represents a formidable gathering of scholarship. How to translate scholarship and research into meaningful policy that will prevent or help prevent the further erasure of culture, to say nothing of human lives in this region? I know it's a big question. I welcome any thoughts.
I think that we have to work in different directions. On the one hand, the dialogue has to be promoted, but the dialogue has to be done by sovereign nations. It has too often was usurped by Russia, that pretended to act as a cultural mediator, as in the Soviet times, but we see that it is unable to accomplish this role. And it is, so the nations actually have to, in the post-Soviet space, have to be able to discuss this question without trying to find compromises that would not be diminishing, that would not be destructive for their cultural heritage. So there are problems that have to be disentangled, right? On the one hand, it is the question of sovereignty, but on the other hand, it is the question of being able to conduct, to perpetuate one's cultural life on a territory. And it is something which is not very easy to do. On the other hand, obviously, the awareness has to be raised that there is such a thing as a cultural landscape, and the small nations need it more than, well, they are obviously more vulnerable, there is more frailty to them. They can't migrate from one angle of a territory to another. When the territory is destroyed, obliterated, they remain homeless. And that is a very that is an essential point. And I think that in the West, many people are indifferent to that point. It is not. Many people do not see that actually for small nations, the link to the memory of their generations, to the monuments, to the places of their encounter is essential. They can't survive otherwise. And so it is a project that has to go in different directions. Yeah.
Well, one of the fundamental problems we seem to have, and it is not unique to this particular region or conflict, is we have differing versions of reality, essentially clashing against each other, and so it's no small thing to create a volume that, dare I say, is grounded in reality and facts and historical truth and accurate research. So I thank you all, and to all the people who participated in the volume for doing this important and valuable work. And there's one last question, and perhaps it's a sensitive question, but I will ask it anyway. Is there hope that the book will become less expensive and therefore more accessible in the future? Please give us hope.
Well, I don't know, because in fact the book is published on demand, I think, and this is why it's quite expensive. This is also why it's expensive. But I don't know if the price will decrease in the future.
You will allow us to hope that perhaps before too much time passes, there will be a paperback version that will be more accessible to general readers. This is not a criticism; it's merely an observation. And there are many people I know who will want to get their hands on this book, because it truly is a most valuable contribution. And again, I thank you and I congratulate you on the work. Let me then conclude and say to the audience, thank you for being with us during this time, and to the speakers, and including Sebouh, who is now gone, but also Igor, Haroutioun, and Marcello. Thank you so much. And for those who are looking for more information on the book, you can find information online, or you can contact NAASR, and we will get the information into your hands. And gentlemen, thanks for the great work. Have a good day or night.